All right. Well, we've gotten finally past the Pentateuch, gotten past the early prophets, and now we were at the period just before the exile with guys like Amos and not Amos, but Jeremiah and all of those. But Jeremiah still's not written down yet. Jeremiah lived during the Babylonian invasion and the fall of Jerusalem, but the writings haven't appeared just yet. So we're going to take this period now, and tonight we're going to cover the exilic writings. That is, after the destruction of Jerusalem, when Nebuchadnezzar takes the people off into exile into Babylon. During that time, it was one of the high water marks of Hebrew literature, Hebrew composition, Hebrew editing, the compiling of different books. And one of the first ones during that time period was Obadiah. Obadiah is witness to the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC and the destruction of the temple. And it's actually not based on a prophecy regarding Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar so much as it is concerning the fall of Edom. Edom was this nation, mountain-dwelling nation, and they're the ones who are supposedly descended from Esau. And so Obadiah describes this encounter with God, with Yahweh, and he talks about the arrogance of Edom and charges them with the violence that was committed against your brother Jacob. He says, Jacob referring to the kingdom of Israel, right? Not only is he talking about the violence done by the man Esau against the man Jacob, no, he's talking about the descendants of both. And Edom actually taking the side of the Babylonians against them, against Israel. And throughout most of the history of Judah, Edom was under control of Judah and Jerusalem. They were a state that was paying tribute, a vassal state, that was paying tribute to Jerusalem, and they were looking for an opportunity to break loose from that. Obadiah then says that this high terrain of their residence up in the mountains had gone to their head. You think that because you're living up on the mountaintop that you deserve a place on the mountaintop, and you look down on everybody else. He said that they were prideful, arrogant, and he says, though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down. Wow, declares the Lord, Obadiah says. Now, during the siege of Jerusalem, beginning in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar II, technically, he had sacked Jerusalem, he had carted away the king of Judah, and installed a puppet king. He's installed somebody who's going to do his bidding, going to do what he wants to. And then off he goes. Well, so Judah begins to think, hey, he's gone now. We can go back and do what we want. And of course, people like Jeremiah are going, no, you got away with your lives. This guy will crush you. Well, no, he's gone. And they thought they were going to, actually thought they might even be helped out by the Egyptians through all of this. Well, the Edomites had gone in with Nebuchadnezzar, and they actually plundered the city. The Jewish folks are like, we're supposed to be relatives. And the Edomites, of course, are going, yeah, exactly. We're supposed to be relatives, and yet you subjugated us and left us as a vassal state. Yeah, so now turnabout's fair play. Well, the Obadiah, when he's writing his prophecy, somewhere around 590 BC, he says that you guys should have remembered, blood's thicker than water. He says, on the day you stood aloof, while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor gloat over them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. Well, Obadiah is saying that Yahweh is saying, you guys are going to get yours too. Don't you worry about it. He said, I will wipe out the house of Esau once and for all, forever, and there won't even be a remnant left. That's always been a theme that has been important to them, is that no matter what happens to us, there will be some remnant that remains. There will be somebody left to tell the story about what's going on with the people of Judah and Israel. But not so with the descendants of Esau. There won't even be a remnant left of you. Wiped out forever. Well, the Edomites' land would be possessed by Egypt, and they won't even be a people anymore. That's where you get a famous phrase that you start hearing, they will not be a people, which will get reiterated among the prophecies to the nation, is that you will always be a people. It's kind of, this is what they're getting, but you, Israel, Judah, will always be a people. The day of the Lord is at hand. Now remember, it was Amos who introduced the idea of the day of the Lord, and he said, the day of the Lord, you don't want it, because that's when, in Michael Corleone terms, today I've handled all family business. It was going to be not just the nations, it was going to be the people of Israel themselves who would also be brought to judgment. Well, but now, by the time of Obadiah, the day of the Lord is not going to include just Israel, it really will include all the other nations too. Someday, the people of Israel will come back out of captivity in Babylon, and they will wind up taking over the land of Edom, he says. Well, that's the prophecy. One of the few prophecies that's not going to include somebody like Babylon or Egypt or somebody like that. This is going specifically after them because you guys were collaborators with the conquering Babylonians. So you're going to get what's coming to you too. Oh, don't worry. Babylon will get what's coming to them. The Egyptians will get what's coming to them. But even you, little Edom, yeah, you're going to get it too. Well, that's about the sum total of Obadiah. He appears quickly, has a specific target in mind, and is also encouraging to the people of Israel, of Judah, because he's saying, look, you'll come back after all this is done, and you'll take what's theirs. You'll have the mountains of Seir. You'll have all that stuff that belonged to them one time. Well, also during this time, we have and I didn't bold it, sorry, when the Deuteronomistic history is finally completed. Joshua, Judges, the book of Samuel, and the book of Kings. And remember, in the Hebrew Bible, it's just the book of Samuel and the book of Kings. Only in the translations did it become 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So there's that. Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, gets expanded. Remember, we talked about that originally it's just chapters 4 through 27 that is the core of Deuteronomy. And now they've added on during this time an introduction, the first 4 chapters there, and then kind of the last section, chapters 29 and 30, wind up being kind of an introduction to what's going to come later. And when you look at Deuteronomy, the last bit, you see the death of Moses. You see Joshua taking his place as the successor to Moses. And then the opening lines, the Lord said, Moses, my servant, is dead. It's a beautiful transition now to the time of Joshua. So introduction to Joshua, then later what becomes of the Judges, and all like that. I was hearing somebody the other day that was complaining about it being called the Book of Judges, because these people weren't just judges, they were like, emergency military commanders. Okay, come up with a better word then, What, you want to use dictator like the Romans used? No, we don't want that. And these were people who simply were called for an occasion. When the occasion is handled, they go back to their jobs. Gideon goes back to the wine press where he's threshing the wheat. All the rest of them go back to their normal jobs when the crisis is over. Because during the time of the judges, it was just a confederation. There was no central government, no king, none like that. That will come in the book of Samuel, when we'll see Samuel anointing Saul as king because the people demanded a king. They wanted to be like everybody else. So first comes Saul, then comes David and Solomon, and the rest of them like that. Now, during this time also, we've got our guy Jeremiah. Okay, Jeremiah and Amos are probably my two favorites of the bunch. He's living during the time of Josiah, the boy king who had grown up, had started a reform and all that stuff. They had found the new scroll that had been hidden away back in the storage room someplace, the scroll of Deuteronomy it was supposed to be. But we get the feeling that Jeremiah is at first really supportive of Josiah. He likes the reforms that Josiah is doing. But somewhere along the way, Jeremiah kind of changes his mind about all this. According to my reading of it, he doesn't like this scroll of Deuteronomy that's been found because it's representing something different than what had always gone before. In fact, if you remember I forgot the passage now, but Jeremiah says, you guys say that the Lord is with us because we have the law. What you have is a lie from the pen of the scribes. Holy smokes. That's pretty indicting stuff. Calling the book of Deuteronomy basically a lie from the pen of the scribes. So when people want to, I was talking with a guy the other day, they so desperately want, here's a fancy phrase, it's called univocality, that the Bible speaks with one voice. One vocality speaks. They want the Bible to be consistently telling the same message from start to finish, and it's just not that way. Again, compare in the book of Kings when it talks about the death of Josiah, and Josiah is a good guy, and Josiah was doing what he thought the Lord had told him to do, and he's going off to thwart the plans of the enemy. But then you read Chronicles, and it says that wasn't the will of the Lord at all. These are two different, one's a northerner and the other's a southerner. That kind of explains a lot of things about every place. I don't care if you're talking about Germany, if you're talking about America, the difference between North and South is always pretty significant. Well, the same goes true for these guys. So you have, on the one hand, the Deuteronomist writing this scroll, and Jeremiah at first buying it, but then going, I don't think so. I don't think this is right. Jeremiah actually launches an assault on Hebrew religion at this point. He says that you guys have fallen so far away. And then he talks about a group called the Rechabites. And he said these Rechabites, they believe that God has told them not to drink wine, and he has a list of things that they're not supposed to do. Did God tell them that? Jeremiah asked. No, I don't think so. But they believe that God told them that. That is faithfulness, he said. So he's looking at what we do in our hearts and the faithfulness that we have towards God. Jeremiah becomes probably the most quoted of all the Hebrew Bible literature by Jesus. Jesus will reference Jeremiah more than anybody else. Well, there's a reason why. It's because I had talked with a rabbi friend of mine, and I said, you tell me, what's the difference between us? What's the difference between Christianity and Judaism? And he goes, oh, that's easy. And I'm like, are you going to insult me? And he goes, no, we believe that your actions are everything. You break a commandment, you gotta do something for it. You gotta atone for it. You can't break these commands, these rules, the 613 rules of the, yeah, seriously. 613 rules in the Torah. You gotta follow those. You break one of those, you're in trouble. You guys, he said, you think it's all in the heart. When Jesus says, you've heard you're not supposed to commit adultery, but if you do it in your heart, it's as bad as if you've already done it. And he goes, we can think about it all day long. I said, all right. He says, for you guys, it's what's transpiring inside. He goes, I think that goes back to an ancient belief that we kind of look at the body is the life. That when the body dies, it's pretty much over with. Really? I said, even today? And he goes, well, not everybody. He goes, there's people who will believe in heaven and stuff like that. And he goes, but in our official theology, he says, we don't look at it that way. So what you do, your actions in this life are everything. For you guys, he says, you can do stuff, but if your heart gets right, well, everything's fine. And I said, did I mention I'm glad I'm a Christian? And he says, yeah, I think it's easier that way. And I'm like, no, because containing the intentions of the heart is tough stuff. So, anyway.
Wait a minute.
Uh-huh.
Did you say they don't believe in heaven? Or did I mishear you?
No, I'm afraid that's right. They
So
basically don't believe
in
in
then when they die?
the ground.
And it just stays there forever?
They believe that the blood is the home of the soul, basically. It's called the nephesh. That when the body goes into the ground, the soul goes into the ground too. Remember, back in Genesis, when God says to Cain, your brother's blood is crying from the ground. Now, there are more, I'm going to use the word Hellenistic Jews, those influenced by the Greeks, and they have come to believe, yes, there is a place called heaven. Hell is pretty much, hey, look, they survived the death camps. They're not too worried about the afterlife, you know, and God knows who can blame them. So yeah, for many of them now, it depends on which, group, because you've got the Orthodox and the Reformed and the Orthodox and Reformed and Conservative Judaism. And they will have different viewpoints on that. Many of them do believe in heaven, a place where you will go. Many of them don't believe there's anything after. They believe that life is basically the chemical processes of the human body. And when that ends, it all ends.
It's all over.
Yep.
There is no more.
Yep.
And is that the, I've always heard that in Jewish faith, a baby is not a human until it takes its first breath. So
Absolutely.
anything before the first breath is not a human.
Correct. Yeah. That's why when people want to talk about abortion in the Bible, good luck.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to wind up like you want it to. When people say, well, the Bible is against abortion. No, it's not. It doesn't say anything about right or wrong. And when it does speak about abortion, it talks about when an abortion must be committed.
Yes, because of the mother.
Because of the mother, exactly right. And it even gives instruction how to do it. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
Right.
Did you guys know that?
And I heard it of all things in the Catholic maternity ward.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, I know, but they were very good nuns. It had to do with a mother who was, it was a bad birth, okay? And, the talk between the two nuns was this, and this is where it came up, this is not a fetus, this is a baby.
Right.
No, this is not a baby because it has not been, it
Correct.
did not take its first breath. Now, the question was, do you baptize or not? And of course, these were nuns and you better baptize. But,
Yeah.
you know, but they were also very progressive in that they wanted the rabbi there. They did not, they,
The rabbi?
Right.
yeah, they wanted to.
They were Catholic and they wanted the rabbi there?
Well,
No,
Jewish.
no,
Oh.
the family, yeah, not the nuns.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'm
okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although I have to tell you, I read a
I
book.
thought, wow, they are progressive.
I read a book and they were literally talking about this hospital that I'm talking about.
Oh.
And this woman was a Jewish mathematician,
Uh-huh.
and she said, well, if I ever get sick, send me to that hospital because I'll die for sure, they're no good. Just take the crucifix off the wall. Laughing because of this incident in the maternity
Yeah.
ward. And they really, what I took out of it, now I'm a student, right, and I'm, you know, big smart 19-year-old, and I'm like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever heard.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's because you always think of babies, you know,
Mhm.
nope.
Yes.
And it wasn't even a forced upon them kind of an idea. It was, this is very sad, we were looking forward to, you know, a new, all these things, but this is not a child.
Right. Oh.
Like, was it born dead? Because how
No,
come it
it
didn't
was-
take its first birth?
If it would have taken a breath, it would have been a baby.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean. How-
No, it did not. It was actually very deformed, you know. But no, and if it would have taken a breath, that would have been completely different ballgame.
Oh, yeah.
But what struck me as this very impressionable 19-year-old was, wow, how can something in literally one breath become something different?
Right.
You know, I mean, it was
And
amazing.
it was born or not?
Oh, it was born, it just
Okay.
never took a breath.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You know. and-
Stillborn, I guess, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I guess, yeah, I guess that's what you would say, except he moved, you know.
Oh.
It's just,
It had to have breathed. It can't move without getting air.
yeah, no, you could.
For a
Yeah.
few seconds, probably.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's
Yeah.
nothing like he
Yeah,
was
just
thrashing or,
Probably
Right,
just,
right.
you know, but it
After
was
birth,
just,
maybe.
you know, to flop an
Still
arm
connected to
or
the mom.
something
Yeah.
like that.
But you know,
Yes.
that transition is just as quick at the end of life. You take a breath,
Yeah,
and then you're a corpse.
yes, it's one breath,
Yeah, one breath makes all the difference.
yeah.
Do I go on the ground or does my soul go up?
But it was very, it's something that stuck with me so much, especially
yeah.
now with all the abortion thing. And those pictures, I am a human,
Yeah. Well,
not so much. I mean, not.
yeah, the Bible's
it's
not going to
okay.
help in
Yeah,
that.
the Bible's not going to help.
Yeah.
The other things, that's a different story, but it's not biblical,
Right.
you know.
Right.
But,
That's interesting to me.
It is. It is not. Somebody had asked me one time, I think I've told you this before, a student of mine said, if you could go back in history, talk to anybody, who would you want to? And I'm like, oh, Jesus. And they were like, oh, sure. I'm like, well, what would you ask him? Just how bad did we miss it? Just how far afield have we gone? And they're like, oh, that would be a good question, wouldn't it? I'm like, I'm afraid it would make us pretty sad. But, you know, the development of religion is as much a cultural thing as it is a theological thing. And yeah, So you wind up, going into the Catholic Church, for example, and, well, they take seriously the mandate about be fruitful and multiply. I'm not assigning any sinister intent to that, but more tithe payers is always a good idea if you're running a church. But on the other hand, you have the Jewish community who says the life of the community is the most important thing, not the individual. So what's good for the community is the best thing, whether an abortion or any of those things. It's what's best for the community. So in Christianity, we are strongly for the individual. And so even with the sense of the individual, not only parent, but also that fetus, unborn child, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to say any offensive language, but yeah. So it's the sensibilities of the religious community is, hey, or you go to the Buddhists and they're like, there's no such thing as a soul anyway. So what? I've had those conversations with many people before, and they're talking about the horror of abortion, how horrible it is. And so I finally asked somebody, what do you think happens when that child is aborted, fetus is aborted? What do you think happens? Well, they probably go right into the arms of God. Well, then why would you deny them that? And then, secondly, if someone wants to have an abortion, clearly they don't want to raise a child, why would you force them to raise a child? All of those things are questions that plague us all, and I don't have any answers. I barely have the questions. And mostly, I think that I was born with the wrong equipment to even have a voice in this conversation. I think it's between women and their healthcare provider. Sure, you can talk to your husband or your family if you want to, but hey, look, I guess in that sense, I am firmly pro-choice. I believe in. Now, as for me, somebody asked me months ago, and they said, what do you think about abortion? I said, let me just say this. I will never, ever believe that I should have an abortion. And she was like, oh, you're being cute. No, well, I can't help myself. But what I think is, I can only speak for me. That's all I can do. Remember that song from the 60s? He can't even run his own life. I'll be damned if he'll run mine. That's a real thing for me. I firmly believe that, look, I got enough to take care of right here. You guys, we'll talk, we'll study, we'll look at things together, but your choice is your choice. Yours, not mine. And I don't really have any interest on trying to impose my feeble views on anybody else. Look, we're struggling to find out the answers. We're struggling to find meaning and what life is all about. So when it comes to issues like that, check please.
I have one more question on that. What about the Amish and Mennonite? What do they believe in for as far as abortion? Do you know?
As far as stated doctrine goes, I don't know, but as far as practice goes, they do it all the time.
Really?
The other thing you said, as religion developed, it was cultural and it was also male.
Oh, absolutely right. Oh, you're so right about that. Well, and that's part of what I mean by culture too, is that, it's a patriarchy in all of the religions. Funny thing is, it didn't start out that way. That when the so-called great religions developed, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, it was the guys in charge. But you go back, anthropology shows us that the earliest religions that we can look at were matriarchal. Well, somewhere along the way, guys decided that, hey, we know how to craft swords and we know how to use them, so we're going to be in trouble. You know, and you look at the women leaders of the world, with the exception of Margaret Thatcher, but you look at Queen Elizabeth, you look at Indira Gandhi, you look at
Golda Meir.
that's the one I was looking for,
Yeah.
Golda Meir.
From
Oh
Milwaukee.
my gosh, what's that?
From Milwaukee.
Yes, absolutely. When the terrorist group Black September killed the 11 Israeli athletes, she assembled her leadership, Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, the leaders of Mossad, the Secret Service or the intelligence, and she gives the line, "We will cut off the hand that has reached out and touched our children." Never once losing her sense of being a mom, and yet turning it into incredible strength. Yeah, I wouldn't mind at all if the guys just took a back seat for the next couple of thousand years. Maybe
I read
more.
about some Native American tribes, and I can't remember which one it is, which is too unfortunate for me. The women were the ones who made the decision whether or not they would go to war.
Yeah.
The men had to go to war,
Yeah.
but they couldn't pick a fight. They had to convince the women
Yeah.
and whoever and it wasn't really, they were really like chiefs. I mean, whatever
Yeah.
I can't think of what the names were, but it was like you had the head female, the head male, but they were chosen, it wasn't like a forever job,
Right.
you
right,
know,
right.
kind of a thing, and you could have all the young guys come back and say they were really disrespected and you were gonna go and, you know, let's think about this
Yeah.
for a while.
Yeah.
Should do that.
Yes. And there's an old story that Crazy Horse, the leader, one of the leaders of the Oglala, I think, going against Custer, that in their tribe, a child would nurse from every woman in the camp, so that he called every woman in the tribe mother. Well, that makes you really want to defend, you know, your people. The whole family is mother. I mean, you know, Hillary Clinton wrote the book It Takes a Village. Actually, I think she plagiarized it, but never mind that. But It Takes a Village, yeah, absolutely right. And yeah, in so many native cultures, the women were the property owners. Of course, in North America, most of the time they didn't believe in owning property. But they were also the ones who were kind of like the council. You know, you had the medicine man, like Sitting Bull, who would have visions and offer counsel and stuff like that. But yeah, that system tended to work pretty well. All right, well, back to Jeremiah.
Sort of got you off track again.
That's all right. I'll always find my way back. So Jeremiah then, his prophecy is actually a prophecy to the people in exile in Babylon. He's telling them, look, there will be hope out of this. He tells the story about what's happened, what has become of the kings, what has become of the ruling class, what has become of the people who are gone into exile. And he says, look, exile, it was all because of pagan worship, that it was punishment because you had departed, and yet because they believed that the temple was going to protect them, he gives this fascinating sermon called the Temple Sermon, where he says, no, the temple is a building. You think that God resides in there? No. I mean, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool, and you're going to build me a house? We always make that a declarative sentence with an exclamation point, and you will build me a house. I don't think that's the way that should be read. It's like, really? You're going to make me a house? Okay, this is for you. It's not for me. Well, Jeremiah is saying, hey, look, you guys had it coming. You were warned. You were warned by all the prophets. You were warned by good kings. You were warned time and time again, but you just couldn't control yourselves. He uses kind of the Hosea language. He said, you guys, you're unfaithful, like an unfaithful wife. You're like rebellious children. And so, judgment is going to come. But, don't worry. Jeremiah says, and he's the first one to say, there will be a new covenant. And it's this wonderful passage where he says, this new covenant, you won't even have to say to people, know the Lord, because everybody's going to know the Lord. Basically, he's saying, look, following this new covenant will be like breathing. It'll be natural. You will want to do it. So he says, when we look at Jeremiah, we see these oracles that are in there. And the ones that come from the mouth of Jeremiah are probably the ones that are in the poetic sections in chapters 1 through 25. We know that the book is heavily edited, and there were followers of Jeremiah who would actually include stuff that would be more pertinent to what was happening to the people in Babylon at the time. Maybe even it was our old friend Baruch who had added some sections in there, because we know that there is a section of the temple sermon that is authentically Jeremiah, and then there's kind of a recapitulation of it, which is probably Baruch, who's kind of re-explaining that. Well, we have Jeremiah in two versions. One is in Hebrew, and the other is, of course, from the Septuagint version in Greek. Are they exactly the same? No. No, they're not. But, of course, we look to the Hebrew one as the more authentic. Well, Jeremiah gets structured it's a long book. It's one of the four, they call it major prophets. I don't like it when they use terms like major and minor, because it sounds like their message is minor. There's nothing minor about Amos at all. They should just use longer and shorter. The longer prophets and the shorter prophets. Well, in chapters 1 through 25, we have the main core of Jeremiah's message. The next three chapters are kind of biographical material, and also is interaction with these other prophets who are basically being paid by the king. And Jeremiah does not get along well with them at all. Chapters 30 through 33 is God promising a restoration, the new covenant that we talked about. And that new covenant gets interpreted differently in Judaism and in Christianity. In Judaism, this new covenant is more of a restoration of the covenant as it should have been. In Christianity, it's a whole nother thing. It's a different covenant altogether. Something new, something improved, Christians would say. In chapters 34 to 35, it's the interaction with the king Zedekiah and the fall of Jerusalem. The next 5 chapters are punishment for the nations that are surrounding Israel. Again, Edom gets mentioned, Moab gets mentioned, Ammon gets mentioned, I think. All of those who weren't there to help their neighbor, Israel, Judah, is pointed out for punishment. And then chapter 52 is simply kind of a retelling of a lot of the story that we see in 2 Kings. It's a fascinating book. It's, it's a guy who doesn't really want to be a prophet, and yet he can't stop himself. He says, it's like a fire shut up in my bones. Now, I've heard people use that. I've heard ministers, I had a college president when I was teaching at a college, and he goes, I just want the word to be in you like a fire shut up in your bones. And I'm like, I don't. that's not nice. And he goes, well, what do you mean? It just means that you need to study Hebrew is what you need to do. I mean, I know you're a New Testament Greek kind of guy, but let me tell you, when Jeremiah is talking about the fire shut up in his bone, he said it is a torment. It is a torture. He said to speak is just as horrible as to not speak. I don't want to say this. Jeremiah is a nice guy. He's a nice guy with a bad mouth, apparently. He loves people. He doesn't want them to go through this, and yet he tells them, you're gonna get it. In fact, Jeremiah even prays one time, okay, all these guys, my enemies, just kill them. Why don't you just kill them all? And the Lord, of course, doesn't answer. Just never responds like that. Anytime we have those kind of prayers, yeah, I'm sure the Lord understands. But he's not going to do anything about it. He's not going to get them. He's not going to do that stuff. No, Jeremiah was like, okay, never mind. And that's one of the things we not only love about Jeremiah, but about the whole Hebrew Bible, is that they are brutally honest about themselves. I mean, the whole Hebrew Bible is about, this is where we messed up. And yet, God comes back for us. Yeah, we get punished, but God restores. Yeah, we wind up doing stupid things, but God will save us in the end of all this. And even when we say things that are absolutely vengeful, God just goes, I got nothing. I'm not saying anything about this. Jeremiah is that honest. Well, then we get our guy Ezekiel. Ezekiel, he is actually in Babylon from the years 592 to 571. There, in the book of Ezekiel, we see these 6 visions of Ezekiel, who is, again, exiled in Babylon. During the 22 years from 593 to 571, but it's really the results of this long, drawn-out history. And Ezekiel is telling a longer story than the prophet himself. The words of the prophet, are they preserved? Yeah, but not exactly. Ezekiel went through a lot of editing as it went along. But the visions, the book itself is broken up into 3 major categories. There's the judgment on Israel, and that's chapters 1 through 24, a long section of the book. Then there's the judgment on the nations, 25 through 32. And then there's, again, the future blessings for Israel, chapters 33 through 48. It's focusing on the presence of God, on purity, on Israel as being a divinely priestly nation to the world, and also talking about the individual's responsibility. That makes Ezekiel a little bit different from some of the others. He talks about what is in us, what our responsibilities are. Well, later on, there will be other things that are interpreted there, kind of mystical. Oh my goodness, Ezekiel sees the wheel within the wheel, and we even had a Southern gospel song about that. Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle of the air. And I was always fascinated by that. Hey, let's sing that Ezekiel song, because I can't figure out what that means. When I'm a little kid, I would always ask my grandfather, hey, what does that mean, Ezekiel saw the wheel? And he goes, I don't know. Do you know what a wheel is? Well, yeah. Well, he saw it way up in the middle of the air. People have called it UFOs. They've called it chariots of angels. They've called it all kinds of stuff. Do we know what it is? I don't know. Like my friend Gary was a teacher, and he was like, I don't know. I'll ask Ezekiel when I get to heaven. And a student said, oh, what if he's not in heaven? And Gary goes, well, then you ask him. Well, so Ezekiel now is, we see this, the mystical stuff, but also he winds up getting quoted a lot in the book of Revelation. If you want to understand the book of Revelation, you have to know Ezekiel and Daniel and a good bit of Zechariah. The author of Revelation keeps looking back to that apocalyptic literature and saying, look, what was said back then is still true today.
I think our reading for today was in Ezekiel and the same thing in Revelations 10, 1 to something.
Exactly.
The exact same wordings.
Exact same wording. When, for example, when John talks about the lake of fire, oh, we all get scared and we all, thinking about this is hell. Well, no, because or the grave. Think it's a place of punishment, and yet Revelation says that death and hell, death and the grave, would be thrown into the lake of fire. Well, how in the world are they the same thing if one is thrown into itself? It doesn't work that way. But you look at Daniel at chapter 8, I think, when it talks about the ancient one who sat on the throne and fire poured out from his presence and pooled around him, forming a lake of fire. The lake of fire is the presence of God. Well, you got to know Daniel to figure that out. Otherwise, you turn it into some monstrous thing that we're all afraid of that, oh no, it's going to be waiting for us. Well, John says that we all go through the lake of fire. That's kind of that's good news. We're going into the presence of God, where all the worldly stuff is finally, taken away from us. Not purgatory, it's not like that, but yeah.
Hang,
Say what?
we're not going to hang there for a
Oh,
while.
no, I hope not. Really? So, in Ezekiel, then it was a big influence on what's called Second Temple Judaism. That is, the temple that was built, rebuilding Solomon's temple. Well, the Second Temple becomes a huge source of Jewish theology, rabbinic theology, and later Christianity too. So in Ezekiel, you've got this threefold structure. I actually repeated myself. I don't know why in the world I did that. That's what happens when you walk away and then come back later to do it. Anyway, so there's the three sections all over again. So the book opens with this vision of Yahweh, and then it goes on to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and like Jeremiah, Ezekiel explains this as this is God's punishment. But again, ends the same way as Jeremiah. There will be a restoration. There will be even a new temple, he says. The first vision in Ezekiel chapter 1 through, I think, all of chapter 3, is God comes to Ezekiel like he's some kind of great warrior. Hey, look, you're the guy who's going to be, you're going to be with me, and God is then seen as a great warrior riding on a chariot. And the chariot is drawn by 4 living creatures. Remember the 4 living creatures in Revelation? Exactly. The 4 living creatures, each one though has got 4 faces, the man, the lion, the ox, and the eagle. Each of them's got 4 wings, and besides each of these creatures is there, we got the wheel within a wheel. All that. They were tall and awesome, with rims of this chariot of the wheels actually full of eyes. And it's not scary, it just simply means God sees everything. 360 degrees, nothing escapes God's notice. And then God says, okay, you're going to be my prophet. You're going to be a watchman in Israel. And he says, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites. Then he pronounces judgment on Judah and Israel and all the nations. God tells him to beware of the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction that is going to be brought by all these other nations. But these nations that have troubled God's people, they'll get theirs too. The Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, we haven't forgotten the Philistines, haven't seen them since the book of Judges, the Phoenicians of Tyre and Sidon, and the age-old enemy, Egypt. They're going to get theirs, finally. He talks about building of a new city, that the exile is going to eventually come to a conclusion. There will be a new Jerusalem, again, a reference in Revelation talking about the new Jerusalem, and there will be a new temple. The Israelites will all be gathered together, and they will be happier than they have ever been before. The latter times will be greater than the former times. That section was inserted after the exile. It wasn't a foretelling of what was going to happen, although it's worded that way. Actually, it comes around afterwards. Hey, let's put this in. It's like I would write a prophecy right now about who is going to win the Oscar. But wait, the Oscar already happened. I know, that's the beauty of it.
I'll be right.
That's right. Can't possibly be wrong. Well, in this, we have a beautiful, the throne vision, and Ezekiel sees Yahweh in the temple, enthroned in the temple, with all of the heavenly army around him. Then we have the first temple vision, it's called, and Ezekiel describes God leaving the temple because of the people and their sins, their departures, their harlotry, as it's called in other places. That harlotry simply meaning because you have followed other gods. You have betrayed your husband, Yahweh. And after all, Yahweh is the official God of Judah. And then he talks about Israel. Again, calls Israel the harlot bride, among many other things. Then you got the most famous one of all, the Valley of Dry Bones.
Best song ever.
Yeah. Them bones, them bones.
The bone connected to the thigh bone. Yeah. Now hear the word of the Lord. Yeah, that was other songs that we remember too. And so there, the prophet is seeing all this massive army that's dead. This is Israel. This is the people who have been left for dead, left to dry up. There's no life in them whatsoever. But God tells Ezekiel, watch this. And the bones start to come together, and then sinews come on, and then musculature, and then skin comes on, and then finally life is once again breathed into them. That's how Israel will rise again. It's just like bones that have no hope of ever walking again, never being alive again. Watch, this is what I can do. Then we get Gog and Magog. Oh man, we hear about that. No, boy, I remember growing up. Gog was Russia, the Soviet Union, we called it at the time, and Magog was what's the guy's name? Khrushchev. Yep, that because it says that they will come from the north and they will invade Israel and they'll gather together and they'll fight this battle at Armageddon and the blood will flow up to the horse's bridle. And I'm like, I just want to die before that happens. I don't want to see that stuff, and I sure don't want to be there. Well, it's not talking about there isn't any historical correlation between Gog and Magog. Gog was the name of the place. Magog was the guy. Was the leader of them.
I've never heard those two names.
Really?
Really? Me either.
Oh man, you guys miss so much. Being in the South,
Yes,
getting
so-
terrified every day.
It's okay.
I remember
I
just
sleep good.
yeah, you absolutely did. Hearing about raptures that people's going to be taken away, and you're always scared that, oh man, what am I? And I'd wake up at night and I'm like, oh no, if the rapture's happened and I'm left behind. And I'd go and open mom and dad's door, make sure they're there, and I'd see mom and go, oh, that's no bet, but dad's there, so okay, it must be, yeah.
Never heard of raptures until I was old.
Until I went to a Baptist church.
There
Is
you
that
go.
where you
Oh,
were?
okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
I know, they were passing those books around and I said, no,
Yep.
I'm not reading about people being,
No, it's
When we
here
were
I go
listening
and Ron
to
sits,
that-
or here goes Ron and I sit. No, I'm not.
When we were listening to those hours and hours about World War I, that's one of the places they talked about it.
oh
You know,
sure.
Because it was like the worst prophecies of Gog and Gog, and that had descriptions and things, which I don't remember that, but it
Yeah.
was World War I.
Well, you can see how scary that time would be. You had a massive revolution in Russia. You had the Great War. You had the Spanish flu, as it was called. You had pestilence. You had war and rumors of war. You had all these other things that, for somebody who's looking for it, it's going to fit in really well. And of course, being the gentle, holy men that they were, couldn't wait to get out and preach about it and take up the offering. It was a good money-making thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
I like that part.
Fear is a moneymaker for those who are willing to exploit it. Here's the thing about the rapture.
What happens?
People say, well, it's right there in 1 Thessalonians where it says that, and those who are yet alive will be caught up to meet, God will descend with the sound of the trumpet, and those who are yet alive will be caught up to meet him in the air, and so we shall ever be with the Lord. All right, sounds like a rapture. It's not what it says. My dad told me when I was asking all those questions when I was 15, and he was like, okay, son, here's what you need to do. You need to study the biblical languages. That's going to answer your questions, because I can't, he said. All right. And I would always come back to him, Dad, that rapture business ain't happening. And he was like, tell me why. Okay, that line, that the Lord will descend with a shout, all that stuff, sound of the archangel. And it says, and we shall be caught up to meet him in the air. Right? And so we shall ever be with the Lord. Yes. It doesn't say that. First off, it never says up. It says we shall be caught into the arrow, which was a euphemism for the presence of the Lord. So the Lord shall descend, and we shall be caught into the presence of the Lord, and so we shall ever be.
Isn't that beautiful?
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. And after that, I was like, rapture? I don't care about no stinking rapture. And so a cousin of mine, he was like, well, wait a minute. In the book of Revelation, it talks about the 30 minutes of silence. That's when the rapture takes place. I'm like, where do you get that? And he goes, well, because that's what's happening there. I said, look, you can't argue a thing because of the absence of a thing. It doesn't talk about it. I said, you know what that 30 minutes is? What precedes that section is it says that the prayers of the saints ascend to the presence of the Lord, and the Lord calls for silence in heaven. What that means is God is saying, you guys shut it down. I'm listening to the prayers of my saints. Again, a beautiful notion. That's why I always say that Revelation isn't the scary book we make it out to be. It's a story of great hope, great comfort. Well, those who want to be scared are going to be scared. Anyway, so the whole imagery now of Gog and Magog is just talking about external trouble that's coming. And Ezekiel is saying these nations will come against us, will come against Israel, no doubt about it. But even they will be destroyed, and the peace of God will be established. Then the last vision is Ezekiel sees the this new temple community centered around a new temple in Jerusalem, in which God's Shekinah, it's called, the divine presence, has finally returned and resides. Like it had been in the Holy of Holies. Remember, you don't go in there unless you're a high priest, unless you're purified. That's the divine presence. And Ezekiel is saying that will happen all over again. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. It'll be rebuilt. There will even be a new temple, and God's presence will be in it. Well, of course, Christians read that, and we go, talk about us, that we are that temple that is inhabited by God. And Paul picks up on that same thing. Don't you know that you're the temple of the Holy Spirit? Okay. Now we come back. We've talked about first Isaiah. Remember, he was called Isaiah of Jerusalem. He was in the first 39 chapters. Well, that's not all of Isaiah. There's 66 books of Isaiah. So we have a section called Second Isaiah, sometimes called Deutero Isaiah. Just means second. Deutero Isaiah, or Second Isaiah, is chapters 40 through 55. And is it a guy named Isaiah? Maybe, but probably not. But somebody who is not even a disciple of Isaiah, because Isaiah is been dead for almost 200 years at this point. But this is somebody who is in the school of Isaiah, as we say, somebody who has studied Isaiah, who has followed them, maybe even taken part in the collection of certain writings of Isaiah. So Second Isaiah Second Isaiah represents maybe the finest theology of the Hebrew Bible. I mean, Second Isaiah is a thinker. Absolutely inspiring. Well, it's broken up into two divisions there. This author, we call Second Isaiah, chapters 40 through 48, and then 49 through 54. In the first section, 40 through 48, he's emphasizing the nation of Israel. In the second collection there, he's focusing on Jerusalem and on Zion, the home of God, the place where God will reside. There's an introduction in here that is, and the conclusion at the end of it, is always talking about the power of God's word. In the Septuagint, the Greek version, that gets translated as logos, the power of God's logos over everything. So Second Isaiah kind of bookends his section with reinforcing the idea of God's word being over all. There's a second introduction and conclusion inside of these, which talks about the salvation that's going to come to Jerusalem. Then there's different hymns. There's discussion on the nations, the foreign nations. It'll talk about the fall of Babylon, and it will talk about the rise of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great is that Persian king who will finally knock off Babylon once and for all, and it's Cyrus who will let the people go back home. Obviously, that is a little bit of a later addition too, after Cyrus. Then the most intriguing thing is those four, they're called servant songs, which is really takes the message of Second Isaiah and gives just great imagery and impact to it. They're called the servant songs, the servant poems, songs of the suffering servant, and all these are in the book of Isaiah, the second Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible. And you can find in there, look at Isaiah 42, just the first 4 verses, Isaiah 49, the first 6 verses, Isaiah 50, verses 4 through 11, and Isaiah 52, which starts in verse 13 and goes through chapter 53, verse 12. Here's where we get so much of Christian literature and Christian liturgy is out of here. It's here in the suffering songs when we hear the magnificent words, and he shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Yeah, good stuff, good stuff. Now, Christians have taken that, and I should say we have taken that, and have basically appropriated it to apply to Christ. Is Christ who 2nd Isaiah was talking about? I don't think so. I think 2nd Isaiah is talking about the role of Israel. That Israel will have leaders like that who will be in the style of God, who is an everlasting Father, who will be a Prince of Peace, who will be a wonderful Counselor, who will be all those things. And 2nd Isaiah is seeing that as applying to his time and the time shortly to come. This servant of God, servant of Yahweh, is going to lead the nations. But the nations will turn on him and abuse him terribly. I mean, they'll be brutal to this guy. But in the end, that servant gets rewarded. Well, Isaiah is seeing that as happening to Israel itself. That Israel is supposed to be the priestly nation to the rest of the nations. They got beat up. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, anybody who had a sharp sword said, let's go invade Israel. And so 2nd Isaiah is saying, don't worry though. This servant of God, Israel, is going to be rewarded. There will be a good end to this. It's the same message that Ezekiel had, that Jeremiah had, that there will be a return, there will be a restoration of the people. And then there's a bunch of other poems about a bunch of different topics. Usually talking about God's power and asking or demanding or suggesting Israel to listen to God, trust in God. Well, the whole composition of Isaiah is, shows a significant differences in the way that authorship was viewed in the ancient world and the way we view it today. In the ancient world, they didn't think anything bad about adding to a book, like 2nd Isaiah, adding to 1st Isaiah, or Isaiah of Jerusalem. There's nothing bad about that. They thought that the message has been shown to, not only was it true, but now we see further evidence of it. We see further applications of all this. And so to supplement a work that already existed wasn't a bad thing. Now, I mean, if we were to do that, oh man, we'd get thrown out of any college in the world. Oh, that's plagiarism. They didn't have any such idea at the time. It was, this is wisdom, but it's incomplete. Let's add to it. And when it came to books like Proverbs and stuff like that, oh my goodness, they would take anybody. There's one whole section that comes from that is actually a verbatim copying of an Egyptian book called The Wisdom of Anonymity. And say that 10 times.
Can't say it once.
And because they said wisdom is wisdom, it doesn't matter who says it. So let's add it into our book of wise sayings that we've collected. So even though a lot of the authors are anonymous, like 2nd Isaiah, for example, they may have all been priests, but also we can see differences sometimes in some of these writings where it looks like these priests are writing it and they're concerned with the function of a priest. On the other hand, you have these other books where the priest is downplayed a little bit, and it's the function of the government. Well, that's the difference really between the Deuteronomist, that we talk so much about, and this other group called the priestly writers. We can see that Leviticus, for example, it loves the priests. The Deuteronomist is like, you gotta have priests. What are you gonna do? As long as you got a temple. If there's no temple, we don't need them. Well, that in short order is the difference between the literature that we're finding. Well, now, also in 2nd Isaiah, we have this whole theme, and it's really the central theme of the new Exodus. That what had happened, people had been taken off into Babylon. They had been kept captive there, much like they had been captive in Egypt. And while we had an exodus from Egypt, this return from Babylon will be a new exodus, a return there. The people will come back all the way to Jerusalem. And the 2nd Isaiah looks at this as kind of a ritual almost. Much like Exodus had turned into the Passover ritual, this is going to be the same kind of thing, Isaiah says. That there will be a ritualistic return to Zion, not just Judah. And it's going to be Yahweh, much like Yahweh had appeared in the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke on the journey through the wilderness. In the same way, Yahweh is going to lead the people out of Babylon to come back home. And so we know how important that is for Isaiah because he puts it near the beginning of his section in chapter 40 and also puts it at the end in chapter 55. So once again, he kind of bookends the whole thing with this whole idea of a new Exodus. Few new elements, of course, along the way because things are different. He says that the original people of the Exodus had left in a big hurry, a great haste, I think he says. He says that these people in the new Exodus will not go out in haste. Well, he's absolutely right. Again, because he's writing after the fact. They go back in stages. There is a group who goes back under a guy named Zerubbabel. There's a group who goes back under Ezra. Apparently Nehemiah is shortly thereafter. There's like several stages of this return. Like I told you before, I think, because the folks living there were probably born in Babylon. Those who had gone into exile have died in exile. They've been there for well over 50 years. And I know in Genesis that it looks like Methuselah lives for 989 years. They ain't living that long. These guys 50 years is a long, long, long time for them. So these people going back are really going back. They're going home, but it's not a home they've ever known. And that's why some of them go kind of slow. You guys go ahead. You go ahead and build the restaurants and places, and we'll come back later. The land between Egypt and Canaan in the first Exodus was this great and terrible wilderness, an arid wasteland, it says in Deuteronomy. In the new Exodus, the land between Babylon and the promised land will be a paradise. It'll be transformed into a paradise, he says. The mountains will be lowered, the valleys will be raised up. We've heard that passage a lot of times before. And we'll have a level road. You'll be walking straight. In the first Exodus, water was provided by God. Remember, Moses smacked the rock, and then he was supposed to speak to the rock, but he smacked it again. But not very often. It didn't happen all the time. In the new Exodus, God will make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land will be springs of water. everything is going to be different. This is a hopeful look as to what's going to happen. Is that exactly what happened? It felt that way. They felt like crossing the mountains wasn't a big deal. Going through the valleys was nothing. They were getting to go home. They passed great rivers and great springs. So everything that he's describing in the second Exodus is exactly how it must have felt to them. Were they crossing mountains? Yeah. Were they going through valleys? Yeah, but it didn't feel that way. They were going home finally. Well, during the rest of this period, we know that we've talked about Hosea and Amos and Micah and Zephaniah, and those are kind of given another reworking because they've taken those works into exile with them, and they kind of like, yeah, let's change this because it didn't quite work out that way. Well, that's okay. Again, not a crime as far as they're concerned. And we actually have during this time the first collecting of Psalms. These Psalms, boy, oh boy, oh boy, could we spend a whole year on Psalms. It wasn't until 1929, a guy named Schaeffer was excavating at this town in Syria called Ras Shamra, and he found this archive of clay tablets. It had been forgotten about for 2,000-3,000 years, 2,500 years. When was the city was Ugarit? My goodness, I think it was like 1200 BC when it was finally, knocked off and destroyed. But all these tablets were still there. Well, once they started translating these tablets, they would look at them and go, don't know how to tell you this, but this is Psalm 141. What are you talking about? This is the same word, and they start comparing. Oh my goodness. Well, once again, they were taking these psalms that they had found, these hymns, and they were like, that perfectly describes how we feel about Yahweh. And so they would wind up changing the words from Baal to Yahweh, or even to Elohim or El or something like that, because it was so poetic and it was so beautiful, and yeah, that's how we feel, so let's take it. Found out that a whole bunch of these psalms, which were attributed to David, actually predated David by a long shot. But when the phrase says a psalm of David, the Hebrew preposition there, simply la, could mean of, it could mean by, it could mean from, it could also mean in the style of, and it could mean for. That some of these psalms were composed for David to use in worship. It could be thinking about David, in the style of David. So during this exilic period, they start gathering these together, and they started writing their own too. Of course, all you got to do is think for a second. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. These are people who are far from home, far from the temple. Temple's not there anymore. Far from Zion. And they asked, how can we sing songs about Zion? We've hung our harps on the willow trees. We're far from there. How can we sing about it? All of that stuff begins to be collected during this time. And especially the section that ends with Psalm 89 is collected at this point. They will add more and more and more to it. But that's where we got done before 7 o'clock. I'm trying to get you done by like mid-May, and and we'll decide what to do from that, whether to take a break or change subjects altogether or what.